Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hello. Very welcome back to the boat. Who here was at the previous discussion about AI? Okay, great. So for those of you who weren't here, we briefly discussed the possible end of humanity, but then we fixed it. Okay, so now that we have a future that we will be alive in and won't be ruled by robots and won't lead to the end of our atmosphere. Now it's time to try and figure out what kind of future is that going to be. So we've defeated the robots in the last hour, but what are we as humans going to do? What kind of systems are we going to build? What is our future economic system going to be like? So the man to my left here will tell you a little bit more about that. He's written a book called The Future of Capitalism. I started reading it myself. It's very readable, it's very informative, very entertaining. I would highly recommend it. So, ladies and gentlemen, a huge welcome to Paul Collier. He's going to talk to you for the next half an hour or so.
Well, thanks very much. This is, I think, I do a lot of speaking, but this is the nicest setting I've ever spoken in. I congratulate the organisers for doing this. Right? The future of capitalism. Capitalism has to have a future, I think, because broadly interpreted as decentralized decisions subject to a degree of competition, that's the only system we know that kind of works. Tried communism, it really doesn't. All these highly centralized, give one man a lot of power, are a disaster. So the decentralized decision process, that is, I think, the essence of capitalism, is important. But the idea that capitalism can be left on autopilot, that markets sort of self-regulate, I think is just crazy. Periodically, capitalism derails, and sometimes it derails really big time. And I want to start by talking about the three big derailments in capitalism over the last 200 years. That's really the period when we've had capitalism, and it's done wonders. You know, we're dramatically better off than we were 200 years ago, thanks to that decentralized process of competition between firms. But the first big derailment happened in the 1840s. And it happened in my part of the world, because my part of the world, Northern England, the cities of Northern England, were where modern capitalism started. Factories. The first factory on earth is about 20 miles from where I grew up. I grew up in Sheffield. And factories performed this miracle of productivity. People came together. Instead of working solo in a cottage, they worked in teams in a factory, and you got economies of scale because there were lots of people together, and economies of specialization because you did this and you did that. That was the miracle of productivity, and that's why people flocked to the towns and the cities. But, and the cities were indeed wonderfully productive. That's why people went there. They were also, by the 1840s, the nearest mankind had ever come to hell on earth. Because these cities, when you bring people together and you have no facilities, no proper housing, no proper water, no proper anything, they die. And people were dying like flies. The average age for a rural labourer in the 1840s wasn't great. In Britain, it was 33. But in the cities, it was 19. And so that's the first derailment of capitalism. And as we'll come to, it was put right. You know, you got very active public policies that actually, in the late 19th century, that addressed that. Factory regulation and more. Basically huge public health programs, big infrastructure. The second derailment, you know, is sort of within folk memory. That's the mass unemployment of the 1930s. Totally different derailment. It doesn't always derail in the same ways. Right? And again, it was fixed. That's where we got Keynesian economics to the rescue. Right? And then we got a phase of full employment. And it's derailed again. Now, the most, visibly, people date the derailment at 2008, when the banks blew themselves up. But I believe the true derailment goes back well before 2008, goes back to about the early 1980s. And that third derailment is not just about bad banks. It's about two new and very vicious social divides that have happened in most major Western countries, certainly in Britain, certainly in America, certainly in France, certainly in Germany, certainly in Italy. And what are these two divides? One is spatial. It's between a booming metropolis and periodically broken provincial towns and cities. The other divide is not spatial, it's the new class divide. And the new class divide is not like the old class divide. It's not about inherited wealth and social status. It's about education. It's the people who went to college, university, and those who didn't. And if we put these together, and we try and understand why they happened, there are pretty straightforward economic forces that have produced these two big divergences. One is the price we pay for rising productivity of the last 40 years has been rising complexity. The simple things we already knew how to do, to master more productive things, we needed to get more complex. As we get more complex, we need better educated people to get rather specialist skills. And so over the last 40 years, we've got more need for well-educated people who then acquire very specialist skills. Those specialist skills then need to be brought together, and that's the agglomerations. Places where, like London, where you can have very finely differentiated skills, but all within easy access of each other. In London, you can reach 2 million jobs within 45 minutes. Right? So that's the rise of complexity. And then you've got the rise of globalization. And what globalization does is mean that there are fewer places that become world-beating clusters. And because more activities get transferred into things that are internationally tradable with globalization, and those activities then pass from being spread out with national clusters to one big international cluster, or one or two. You see it in finance, where finance is now just, there are basically 3 clusters in the world, one of which is London. And periodically, an existing cluster gets knocked out. I'll give you an example which you'll all know about, which is Sheffield. You'll all know about Sheffield, it's just you don't know it's Sheffield, because a lot of you will have seen the film The Full Monty. Yeah? That's Sheffield, right? Sheffield was a skill cluster of steel. It was 700 years old, we know, because there was a line in Chaucer, written in about 1270 something, saying this knife was a Sheffield knife. And then in the early 1980s, the Sheffield steel industry, partly due to macroeconomic mismanagement, got defeated by a Korean steel industry, and it collapsed totally. It's disappeared. Yeah? And that happened repeatedly in a lot of, that's the broken provincial towns and cities around the world. As it happens, I in my personal life happened to straddle both of these two very vicious divides. So the spatial divide, I'm from Sheffield. I now live in Metroland par excellence. In fact, my postcode where I live has the highest ratio of house prices to income in the whole of Britain, because we are the luxury destination for bankers to put their families. So I was the last academic to buy in my street, which was over 30 years ago, right? So I'm now part of the metro elite. But my family is still firmly anchored in Sheffield, which became par excellence the broken city. And my relatives were part of that. That was their lived experience, redundancy, desperation. And then that other divide, the education divide, the tertiary education, the less than tertiary education. Well, I've got education coming out of my ears when I haven't got these things around me, right? I'm now really fancy. But both my parents left school when they were 12. The book is a very, it's a proper social science book. I'm almost embarrassed to read out that the Nobel Prize winner George Akerlof describes it as the future of capitalism is the most revolutionary work of social science since Keynes. So it's a fancy book, but it's also a passionate book. And those of you in the front will just see the photograph that begins the book. And that's of two little children aged 4. And one is me, and one is my cousin, and we were both born on the same day, in exactly the same social class. And until we were 14, our lives were totally parallel. We were kids from poor homes, we got to decent schools, and then it was 1963. And there's a famous British poet called Philip Larkin, whose most famous poem is about 1963, because it has the line, sexual intercourse began in 1963. The next line, which is Philip Larkin's line, is, which was just too late for me. Well, it was too early for me, but it was just right for Sue. So indeed, for her, sexual intercourse did indeed begin in 1963, and it did for her. So she became a teenage mother. Her 2 daughters became teenage mothers, and by then they were plunged into disaster. So I've got the grandkids. So it's a very personal book, because those bitter social divides that have been at the heart of my own experience, I believe, are entirely avoidable. Entirely avoidable. And the tragedy is we let those divides rip and did nothing about them. So the next question I want to turn to is, why did we do nothing about them? Because historically we would have done, both on the parties of the right and the parties of the left. And let me give you examples of that. In the parties of the business community, the businessmen, the right. So if we go back to the 1840s, and let's go back to the most booming city in the north of England, Bradford. And the guy who became the mayor of Bradford was the major industrialist in Bradford, Sir Titus Salt. And when he was mayor in 1849, what happened in Bradford was cholera. And nobody knew what caused cholera. And he was mayor. He felt a great sense of responsibility for his citizens, and they were dying all around him. And he was horrified. He was the major employer in the city, but he felt a huge personal responsibility for his employees. And so he used his entire fortune to try and make things better. And so he cleaned up Bradford with parks and stuff, and then he built an entirely new town for his factory and his workers. It's called Saltaire. It was the first ever of the new towns. And that got imitated by future businessmen. Cadbury, Lever Brothers, John Lewis, they're all the same sense of responsibility for their workforce, loyalty to their workers. And that was then reciprocated by the workers. So when Titus Salt died, there was the biggest funeral ever in Bradford, and there's a statue to him. It was reciprocal sense of loyalty. And that sense of building reciprocal obligations, workers and firms, that was the essence of a sort of one nation philosophy on the centre right. And that got lost, and only quite recently. And you date it from about the 1980s, and the guilty party is Milton Friedman, who came up with a mantra that the sole purpose of the firm was to make profits. And as long as you deregulated markets and let firms compete with chief executives that made as much profit as possible, everyone would be better off, right? So you just destroy this idea that that the firm is capable of moral obligations, doesn't have any moral obligations, right? And that's just horrifically wrong. You then get two other ideas coming out from the right. One is and the one comes from my tribe, the economists, and it's called Principalagent theory, right? Since we're at an economics conference, some people will know what that means, right? And what it translated into was you get good performance not by building loyalty and reciprocal obligations. You get good performance by dangling big carrots in front of people and tying those carrots to monitored incentives, right? So it's incentives and monitored performance, right? And we see that spread across both the private sector and the public sector. Bonus culture. Right? And so the pay gap, who's you got to motivate most of all? The chief executive. And so the pay gap between chief executives and average earnings in their firms widens from about 20 to 1 in the 1960s. In American finance, it's now reached 500 to 1. Right? If you look around the Western world, it's sort of around the 200 to 1 instead of 20 to 1. Of course, there's no sign that that's actually improved performance, but it's caused huge divisions, inequality. Right? That's what the economists did. And then the lawyers come up with their own great idea for how to get better performance, which is you write more complete contracts. You specify in detail what the job is. Right? So that you remove discretion from people. You say, here's the 18 things you've got to do or observe, and having got those, then the decision follows. You are not an autonomous agent there to think. You are just an automaton, right? So between these two things, between Friedman saying the purpose of the firm is to make money, and then these two technologies of how to make the firm super productive, carrots and sticks, bonuses, and this highly specified jobs, what you do is gut the centre of the labour market, the middle ground of the labour market. 2 days ago in Britain, the Jobs and Skills Survey just came out, and they've asked the same question for 25 years, so we can see what happens. That question is, do you have enough autonomy in your job to be able to do your job properly? And there's been a 40% collapse in 25 years in people answering yes. Right? So 25 years ago, most people said yes. Now most people say no. Right? So that's what happened on the right. And you see what's happening. You're taking away morality from firms and just sort of say we don't need morality. What we need is markets. Right? you then get at the level of the family what I think is also a very vicious narrative of families are the perfect vehicle for reciprocal obligations. You know, the middle generation has responsibilities to the elderly and the young. And of course, husbands and wives to each other. And then that got gutted by this mantra, what does fulfillment mean? Fulfillment doesn't mean meeting obligations, it means personal achievement, you know? And that, just as the morality had been gutted from firms, it became gutted from families. That was what was happening on the right. You actually got a similar process on the left. You get control freaks like Gordon Brown who say, what we need to do is we need some, of course, ordinary people are indeed economic man. You're greedy and selfish, pretty nasty, really. But some of you are nasty rich and some of you are nasty poor. And we can increase global utility by taking some money off the nasty rich and giving it to the nasty poor. And for that, we need a class of saints, right, who will decide all this. And that is me, Gordon, plus one or two others. And his philosophy here is the Platonic Guardians, right? Plato thought all this up. Utopia, right? Anything that says utopia, you know is rubbish, right? Because there is no permanent state that if only we get to that, everything's fine. Just follow this book and here's utopia. You know, crap, right? Fundamentally flawed social science, if you read that, right? The world isn't like that. It's a dynamic and pretty chaotic process where you just need temporary solutions. I'm a pragmatist, right? You look at the evidence and you work out what to do next, and you do your best, right? There's no permanent guidebook and there's no permanent utopia to head to. But Gordon and his crew, you know, were Platonic Guardians, and Plato made one little slip. Plato thought that the Platonic Guardians would be philosophers, and economists put him right on that one. So that's what the economists do on the left. You know, on the right they do these carrots and sticks, and on the left they do the Platonic Guardian stuff. We know best. Social paternalism, the authoritarian directive state. And then the lawyers come along. The lawyers have done plenty of damage on the right, right? Remember the complete contract stuff? And they do the same sort of thing on the left because of rules. They say, oh, you know, these particular groups are victims, and so they need rights. Victims need rights. And can you see what's happening here? What's happening is people are being stripped, people and firms are being stripped of obligations. Where are the obligations going? They're going up to the state. Gordon, right? And what's showering down from the paternalist state is rights. And like all showers, they're heavier in some places than others, right? All victims are equal, but some victims are more equal than others, right? So that's what we got. That's why the practical anxieties that were being generated by ordinary people were not addressed, right? Instead of Sir Titus Salt on the right, we got Friedman's crooks, the bonus-hungry chief executives that just felt greed is good, right? On the left, what did we have in the 1840s? The 1840s, let's go back to that hell on earth. Peasants coming into towns and dying like flies. Very practical anxieties. What do you need? You need a house. You haven't got one, right? Remember, you're dying at 19. Big concern in the 1840s, will I have a funeral, right? You can't get, you know, really brute practical anxieties. Will I be able to buy enough food from the shopkeeper who's a monopoly, because he's the only one who's given me credit, I've got to go back to him. And he's ripping me off. And so what you get in the 1840s, in the north of England, exactly, just where Salt was trying to come up with solutions with salt air and so on amongst workers, you get the birth of the cooperative movement. Rochdale, about 20 miles away from where I live, about 30 miles from where Salt was, the birth of the global cooperative movement. And what's the cooperative movement? It's pragmatic, practical solutions to these very real anxieties. You want a house? A building society. People save, that's the obligation, you save, and that generates your rights, you can borrow. Yeah? In Halifax, another little northern city, the Halifax Building Society became the biggest bank in Britain. It took 150 years to build it, and then in the 1980s, it was what was called demutualized, which means it was moved into private ownership, and the City of London took it over. It had taken 150 years for the cooperative movement to build it into the biggest bank in Britain. It took the city only 25 years to bankrupt it. Right? And then another example of the cooperative movement became the biggest funeral director in Britain. You know, very practical. If you're going to die at 19, that's a dominant concern. So that was where the left started, and it had then got captured by these sort of Rawlsian and paternalist state agendas. The consequence of all this is unaddressed, very practical anxieties. The provincial de-skilling feel, in practical terms, they're very worried about their future, and yet they feel nobody's addressing those concerns. And culturally, they feel despised. There's a famous British commentator called Janan Ganesh, who's he's a very astute commentator, but he's archetypal metropolitan elite. And so he described the view from London of the provinces. And he said, it feels like being shackled to a corpse. Right? A lot of mutual regard and sense of mutual obligation there, isn't there, right? Shackled to a corpse. So I've just, in the latest Prospect magazine, I've just got the cover story where I respond to Janan Ganesh and I say, what's the view of London from the provinces? And it feels like being shackled to a shark. Because that's where these bankers and lawyers, I've got a nephew who's mid-30s, 4 years into law, and his job, as in his law firm, is to work full-time in a bank which is trying to make sure that when the bank fails, which it doubt, sometime in the next 10 years it'll all blow up again, no bank official will have breached any regulation. Right? Basically, let's get away with what we want to do, but don't breach any of the regulations. Right? He's paid £700 an hour for that. Right? Who's paying that? People who use a bank. So what's the consequences of unaddressed anxieties? It's mutinies. Mutinies. People get sufficiently angry and sufficiently worried that they mutiny. And like all mutinies, that's what Brexit was, that's what Trump vote was, that's what vote in Italy was. And like all mutinies, it's not about a vision of the future, it's about deep worries that your real concerns are just being ignored. You're not being heard. Right? The most famous mutiny in British history is Mutiny on the Bounty. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it. Right? Where did the mutineers end up, the mutineers on the Bounty? They ended up in a little island called Pitcairn in the middle of nowhere. Right? Sorry, I hadn't meant to talk about Brexit, but but they didn't mutiny in order to get to Pitcairn, right? They mutinied because conditions on this ship were just unacceptable, right? And so the frustrations boiled over. And so, of course, these mutinies are lamentable, right? But instead of just being contemptuous of the people who mutinied, we should think, why did these things happen? We should have addressed these great divergences. We should have healed them. And so, my last 3 or 4 minutes, let me say that the heart of the book is about what we can do to heal these anxieties, because I'm an economist, and in the end, I believe there's toolkits which will put capitalism back on the rails, just as we put capitalism back on the rails after the 1840s, just as we did after the 1930s. All these crises of capitalism are particular. They need specific solutions. You have to work out what the solutions are in a pragmatic way. There's no global guidebook. You have to look at the context and look at the evidence, think, what can we do? So I'll just give you 3 policies, practical policies. It's kind of 1 minute each, and then I'll hand over to Carla to tell me what's wrong, right? But the first is kind of a no-brainer, which is in Britain and America, 50% of kids now go to tertiary education, now go to college, and 50% don't. Right? And as we've moved it up from a very small minority going to college to half the country going to college, the gap between the esteem of those who get a degree and those who don't has got wider and wider. If 90% of people didn't get a degree, you just said, well, they didn't get a degree, right? If 50% of people getting a degree and who didn't get a degree, you're nobody, right? And Britain and America both do wonderful things for that top 50%. We've got fabulous universities. You know, Britain's got 3 of the top 10 in the world. America's got 4 or 5. You know, and so for the cognitively gifted, that's a brilliant route, right? But if you think about it, the half of the population that's less cognitively gifted is going to then do a much harder transition, because what they need to do is develop non-cognitive skills. They've got to change track. And that's much harder than just carrying on the same damn track, right? Like I did. School, university, blah, blah, you know, it was all just the same track. A few countries get that very right. I don't know about Norway, so I'll not tell you about it, right? The country that I know that gets it really, really right is Switzerland. And in Switzerland, 60% of the population choose to go the vocational route. It's equally prestigious. Some of the chief executives of the Swiss banks took the vocational route. You can get right to the top with the vocational route. It's prestigious because it leads to, it's a 4-year course with a credential at the end of it that is as prestigious as a degree, and it's paid whilst you're on that 4 years. You're getting paid, and half the money, it's very expensive, but half the money is contributed by the firms that will then employ these kids. And so the firms make damn sure that when the kids come out, they're going to be productive, right? In Britain, we've done exactly the opposite. We basically, in the last 40 years, the investment in training for non-cognitive skills has collapsed. It was never very high, but it's collapsed. And that's, I think, what happens unless you really get active and design these intelligent policies. What politicians did was expand college education, over-expand it. So too many people had taken the cognitive route because the middle classes bleated, we want our kids to get a degree too. And so each politician just then opened up more and more university places. So you can see the political dynamics but it leads to a bad place. The second idea is what happens before you're 16. And this is a bit more radical. So basically I'm trying to get away from social paternalism, the idea that the state knows best and that families are sort of irresponsible and just need to be supervised and monitored. And that's social paternalism. It's a sort of top-down monitoring, carrots and sticks and legal requirements. Legal requirements partly in the form of child rights. I knew this was going badly wrong when my 12-year-old, who's ADHD, was shouting aggressively against his 10-year-old sister. So I said to him, Alex, shut up, shut up. And he said, you're abusing my human rights. Great. Get away from social paternalism. What do we replace it with? Well, the phrase is so new that spellcheck won't accept it, but I've called it social maternalism. And the difference between paternalism and maternalism, paternalism basically tells families what to do, takes kids off them, makes women work and that sort of thing. Social maternalism says if you're a young, low-skilled couple of kids who've had a baby, it's going to be really hard. And you need all the support you can get to stay together, bring that screaming 2-year-old up without going crazy about it. And so all the way along the line, from birth right through to work, you need interventions which help families. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a very good new book come out called Thrive, by a combination of an economist who works on happiness, Richard Layard, and a social psychologist. And what Thrive is about is saying a lot of the problems of poor families, stressed families, are mental health problems, including teenagers. With social media, there's huge stresses now amongst, and we've actually got techniques that work pretty well. Cognitive behavioral therapy is dirt cheap, has a 50% success rate, and it's not available. And so that's a classic example of social maternalism. You just scale up these services. Right? And then another idea is mentoring. The biggest difference of all between rich families and poor families is not money, it's the social networks they have. And the biggest difference of all in social networks, this has been measured by Robert Putnam in America, is the answer to the question, do you know a professor? Right? The educated basically all say yes, and the less educated all say no. Right? Now, that matters. I know because I was in exactly that position. When I was 17, I got a place at Oxford to read law, and I realized I didn't want to read law. I wanted to read economics. But I didn't know whether I should write to Oxford and say, please, I'm very sorry, but I want to change. I don't want to come and read law. This is a pretty big decision, right? 17. I didn't know anybody in the family. I needed a professor. I didn't have one. The nearest I could get, the only middle-class person I knew was my dentist. So I asked him. And he was completely useless. Now, when my 17-year-old, he's 17 at the moment, he's had exactly this dilemma. What does he want to do at university? Didn't know whether he wanted to do nanotechnology or not. What did he do? He went next door to the professor of nanotechnology, right? By mentoring, we can build social networks that actually break these acute cultural divisions between the elite and the non-elite. So these are all examples of social maternalism. And then I've got time. Last 1 minute, and then it's you, Cal. This is the one that outrages Londoners, but since there are no Londoners here, it doesn't matter. Sorry. And that is that Londoners think that because they've got all these skills, they actually earn all these ridiculous high incomes. And so the fancy economics bit of the book is to show that actually what they're benefiting from is what's called rents of agglomeration. Rents of agglomeration are just like rents from oil. And Norway has handled rents from oil better than anywhere else on earth. You know, if you ask the question, who benefited from the rents on oil in Norway, the answer is everybody. Who benefits from the rents on agglomeration in London at the moment? The people who own the land and the most skilled of the people. There is the high skilled and the landowners and property owners who capture it. Right? And that is crazy. That's what we should be taxing. What should we use that for? Not to put the north of England on Benefit Street, but to try and create new knowledge clusters where people want to live. So instead of moving the skilled young from where they belong to these metropolitan agglomerations, we should get a humane form of global capitalism in which productivity is shifted towards the clusters where it's most needed. Thank you. Let me hand over to you.
Paul Collier, ladies and gentlemen. Kalamona's coming up next. My only function is to tell you we have about 10 minutes. 10 minutes for your reply, and then we'll have a little chat and go to the audience for questions as well too.
I'm pleased with 10 minutes. I'm going to recommend the book, and then I'm going to be critical. The book is very good. It's equally accessible as his presentation. So he picks things from here and there in the book. The book then is more coherent because it's a little bit more time than he had here. So this is the recommendation. I will remind you about two persons with almost the same name. That is Tom Paine and Thomas Spence. They were both very radical people in the end of the 1790s. One of them wrote a book called Tom Paine, the most famous one. He wrote a book called The Rights of Man. And the other guy, he was very critical, but he had the same idea. He wrote The Rights of Children. And sort of emphasizing the role, being more radical. So I'm Thomas Spence for tonight, and he is Tom Paine. So I'm going to say exactly the same as he said, but I'm going to emphasize even more that the complementarity between social organization in society, in many ways, and capitalist dynamics. That's really the winner in the world today, and that's what the stupid guys in England have forgotten that a long time ago. The complementarity. Let me remind you about a little bit list. Where is the sort of distance between the boss and those who work for the boss, the lowest? Where is the least hierarchies in the firms? Where have women the rights to participate fully? No, you think I'm making up a list for Scandinavian countries. I'm not. I'm just taking the short time to remember some of the things that Alexis de Tocqueville said when he visited the USA in 1830. Nowhere in the world that he was so impressed by the equality of the US. What happened next? After this, at that time, compared to his home country, well, that was France. He was he was on the right side, on the right-wing side. He was really impressed by the US at that time. What happened? We know at that time, 1830, he went for a 9 months visit and wrote a very famous, good book. If you haven't read it, then the best of your life is still open in addition to reading his book. So what happened then? Well, Europe and the US crossed paths. Today, the US is the most inegalitarian country of the modern countries, the rich countries in the world. And the European countries, and in particular European countries in the north of Europe, are the least inegalitarian, the most egalitarian countries. Why is that? It is because the in the US, they were so egalitarian in the starting point that they didn't get a class organization of politics or social movements for the welfare state. These unions were weak for a long time. There's a short period in US history where unions were strong, like having unionization rates of 30 or 40%. Here's my first criticism of the book. There's not a word about unions here. Why is that? That's a really involvement from below type of organization, quasi-democratic organizations, and they have really succeeded. Remember, in the 18th century, the big debate in the socialist movement, which we are halfway discussing here, that was, should we create our own enterprises and take over the economy, creating our own enterprises? And to do that, you needed capital. But the socialist movement didn't have capital, but they had militant workers. So they organized that, but they didn't lack militant workers, and they got that. Today it's opposite. Workers are in the rich world, rather rich compared to then, and none of them are militants. So today we are opposite. More about that in 1 second. So what happened when you got class organization of politics and the welfare state? You got institutions that sort of created involvement from below and empowerment. Where are single mothers best taken care of? It's in countries with generous welfare states. It's in countries where you have strong unions, where you have a sort of countervailing power against capitalist authoritarian rule. That's what you have. And let me put it differently as well. Where do you have long-term contracts, where involvement you really have pressed the firm to have a long view, where you have wage moderation in order to benefit the capitalist development in your own sector? That's why you have strong unions and strong welfare states. Exactly where you have it. Where you have your highest economic growth, maybe that is a bad measure of economic success, but nevertheless it's very much used. Northern Europe has higher economic growth per capita than the US from, say, 1930s till today. So I think that this complementarity, that the stupidity of our time, that I think is emphasized in the book, is also a stupidity in the sense that they think they can do without these old-fashioned organizations. But they have been so beneficial for the capitalist dynamics, both in speeding up the process of creative destruction, because they keep wage differences low. And that means that modernization is more profitable, and you speed it up. And it's also the social care about these organizations, I think, also important. I have to leave families out for. I think you spoke very well about that, and it's very clear in the book as well. But it doesn't really fit into my 10 minutes. But I think this complementarity, that means that you strengthen the other side. You strengthen the capitalist dynamics by organizing people in a different way. What is the stupidity in our time? That we are not allowed to talk about these things because they are old-fashioned. They are not there. The modern thing is the spot market hiring. You're going to have all kinds. He mentioned all the stupid things that I'm exaggerating now when I only have 10 minutes. But look at where you have the long-term contracts in the labor market. We really got some of these things. It is in the countries with generous welfare states and strong union movement. But these things are on decline. There's pressure against it. Sweden has the highest decline in unionization in the world today. But it is from a very high level. So Norway has a lower level of unionization than Sweden. We also have a decline. It's part of the structural change in the economy that you are moving in the direction of more services where unions have less of a tradition. But you're also moving in the direction where there's less capital. But we are living in a world where everybody says that capital is the essential factor of production. That's a stupidity. It's, of course, in the heads of people. It's in the life that people live. And we have very good credit markets. So we can now open up the future for capitalism would be a capitalism where we don't have capitalists to the same extent as we used to have. Because we are educated, we have credit markets, we can organize ourselves, and it's coming. Law firms, they introduced the modern future of capitalism. You see it in law firms for a long time. There's no capitalist, it's the lawyers. You see it in the consultancy firms. There are no capitalists. There's just the consultants themselves, and they own the enterprises they have. You get more and more of these things. Doesn't mean that we have to give up unions and involvement from that side, but they have to understand that we don't have to organize everything in a hierarchical manner, where you have on the top a real boss and on the bottom people who obey his order. That is the old-fashioned capitalism. It wasn't there in the US in the beginning. They had equality opportunity compared to all other places, but the bad things about that they didn't give rise to organize for the modern world. So Europe went through a phase where they had much more sort of class conflict between First World and Second World. That was the worst period of this. A huge waste of resources in conflicts and strikes. After the Second World War, you have much more of a sort of democratic organization from below. Unions, for example, in Northern Europe, they had the highest autonomy in the workplace ever. And that means, for example, we get, I'm finishing up pretty soon, when we got the migrant workers from Poland, for example, they are super workers, but they have a different work culture. So when they come to construction sites where they build houses and so on, they are called pointers. Why? Because you have to point out what to do. That's what they are used to. They are used to have the authoritarian rule. While all the Norwegian workers, they're not that they are better. They have a different culture because they're used to have this social safety nets around them and the social organization around them that allow them to have autonomy. That we know what to do. We know what to do, and we work at an even speed. And of course, the Polish workers will learn this, and they will be equally good as all the others. But it is a really good demonstration of the differences. Norwegian companies, when they go abroad, you don't have to travel further than Germany. Then the German workers don't say, do you talk to the boss? Yeah, of course, the Norwegian worker talk to the boss because he isn't dangerous. He isn't dangerous. You can see, he say, fuck you, man. You can say that because if you lose your job, you have social insurance to tolerate it. So some of these institutions that people are sort of making laugh of, they are empowering institutions, and they help the dynamics of the capitalist economy, and the capitalist economy also help these organizations to survive if we only have a little bit more education that unions, welfare states are necessary conditions if you don't have the ownership of the workers themselves, which I think, by the way, is the future. This is what Thomas Spence would have said. He would have said that you, Tom Paine, you're a smart guy, but you should even take it further. Hey!
You want to go to questions now? I think so. But you still liked the book, though, didn't you? Yeah, you did like the book, yeah. So we'll just let our chance now for in the next 5 or 10 minutes, if there's any questions in the room. Does there anybody want to ask a few questions? I'll start with yourself. So Lucy, is it?
Yeah,
yeah.
Lucy comes.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in what you're talking about, which was mostly social relations, but I want to talk more about political and legal relations. For example, you talked about people moving in older times in England into the towns. Well, they didn't just decide to move. They were the enclosures. They were forced out. This was not just a social, economic. They were forced out of there. And then we get to the question of the CEOs in the 2007 and 8, and in the U.S., the collapse of the system. They made out like bandits because the American government did not, these were crooks, and the American government, the Justice Department, did not go after them. And that's because of political power that enables corruption. Then you talk about Switzerland, Great Switzerland. They are one of the big money laundering operations of the world. When there is corruption in corporations by drug money launderers, they are the ones that are running it. If there is a crime, they are the people that are driving the getaway cars. So I think that when you deal with these issues, it's not just social issues. Did you get a college degree? We have a system that protects the looters and the corrupt dealers, particularly in the West and in the other countries. And I think that is a major question. A lot of these people that are running these systems should be in jail. Instead, they are running the governments.
Yep. Yes, well worth a round of applause. Paul, do you want to reply to that?
Yeah.
Sure, of course.
I don't disagree with that, and indeed I do cover it in the book. There's a what I didn't discuss in the book was the ethical world, sorry, in the talk, but it's in the book. For example, how do you manage to tax international companies, which is very, very important. This tax avoidance by international companies, and the ease of corruption. I've been a very active fighter on that front. I managed to persuade David Cameron to create the first compulsory public register of true ownership of companies in the world. So all British companies now have to be registered with the true owner of the company, and that was because I explained to him that London lawyers were the epicenter of what's called shell companies, which are bogus companies where you can't tell which crook owns it. And I also come up with a solution as how could you have jailed the bankers? So I introduced a new crime, which is called manslaughter. And if you kill somebody, you can be prosecuted for one of two crimes: murder and manslaughter. And you can be found guilty of murder if and only if the prosecution can prove intentionality. You plan to kill this person. You can be jailed for manslaughter even if you didn't intend to kill the person but were reckless. And it's because we didn't have the crime of manslaughter. We could have easily established that the chief executives of the banks were reckless. But what we were trying to prosecute on was murder, and we could not get the evidence of intentionality of bankrupting the banks. And so instead, what we resorted to was fines. Who pays the fines? We do, right? Because they were fines on companies. Ridiculous.
I disagree, because the guy who was the head of the part of the Justice Department dealing with this said the banks, they were too big to jail, they were too important, they didn't want them to collapse. Yes. It's not that they couldn't go after them. They went after small guys, never after the big guys, and it was a purposeful decision.
I think the too big to fail was an ugly reality. The too powerful to jail, I would actually question. I think if we'd had the right crime, it would have been very easy to jail them, and then the movement to actually prosecute, if there'd been a crime of recklessness, they'd have been jailed.
Carla, do you want to, and then we go to more
very
questions.
Much want to sort of not respond directly to what you say, but put things a little bit together. I have to say that I'm very much in agreement with this gentleman here, the sir.
I never used the damn thing.
No, but I did. I mean, say the things hang together. That's the gist of my talk. It was a little bit sort of high on polemics, but I think that's the most important thing that I would like to emphasize. So we try to use the opportunity to use her examples to see that. She mentioned the enclosure movement. That was enclosure movement was strong in Britain, but it wasn't so strong in many other countries. That was taking common land from others and giving it to big landlords, feudal laws basically, and sort of privatizing the land, fencing off those who have property rights but not secure property rights. That was, I think, was very important, but it was rather British phenomena. But the important thing in that context is that some countries had a good division of land and some countries did not. And those countries that had a good division of land had a much better social reform in the 1930s. So things hang together. Why we had better social reforms in the 1930s when the crisis came in the 30s? Because they didn't have conflicts of the same sort that the other. In Italy, they had quarrels over land reform. They got fascism. In Spain, there were also quarrels over land reforms and land distribution. They got fascism. So these things hang together. And I think that's also the gist of the book, that you have all these conflicts, then you open up for wild men like Donald Trump and others similar to him. The Democratic so-called party in Sweden, for example, is also have a fascist roots. So these things, they hang together because there are some unresolved issues that they can play on. One last thing you said, the banks are too big to fail. I would say many people in the world are too rich to be jailed. Yes. And I think that is the important thing. Show me one rich person in jail. So it is low-class people. They are put to jail. The US are full of these people in jail. They don't minor things. But those who really are the real criminals, they are never put to jail. I'll just end by one remark on that. Take corruption scandals. There are corruption all over the world. And this Paul knows all about this also. These cases today, they always come up with sort of negotiated settlements. That means that they are solved before the court case. And they are solved with a penalty. And if you report yourself in, you get a huge deduction on there. There's no open about these things at all. You can't have a functional capitalism on such basis, because you have when people are doing criminal acts, they have to be placed for the courts, and they have to be put in jail even if they are billionaires. But that's not happening today.
Any other questions from the room? Anybody else? Yes, man there with the beard.
You talked about unionism as if it's a goal in itself. Is it a goal in itself, or is it an instrument for greater social good? And more broadly, I wonder whether egalitarianism, as you both talked about, financial equality, is a goal in itself, or would you care if everybody was getting richer?
I think
Did everybody hear the question? Do you want to repeat the question, Paul, just so that they understand? Everybody hears it.
Yeah. So one was about are sort of trade unions a goal in themselves, and the other was is equality a goal in itself? Really, I think what I would say is that the sort of society I would like to see built is one where there is enough social cohesion, which means enough equality, because great inequalities basically frustrate any sense of shared belonging. Enough social cohesion that we accept obligations to each other. We're able to build reciprocal obligations. And a healthy society, I believe, is a dense mass of reciprocal obligations that make our lives vastly better. This is actually the other book of Adam Smith, the famous one that all economists know, The Wealth of Nations. What is now being rediscovered is the Theory of Moral Sentiments as the more important book. And they actually have a very similar message. The Wealth of Nations is basically built on the idea that there's mutual benefits from exchange of goods. And the Theory of Moral Sentiments, in one sentence, is there's mutual benefits from the exchange of obligations. And the benefits from the exchange of obligations are even bigger than the benefits from the exchange of goods. So I don't think of equality as the objective in itself. That's the sort of Gordon Brown social paternalism. Move the dollars from these nasty rich to these nasty poor, right? As if the consumption is the only thing that matters for people. I think people are naturally moral actors who get purpose in life from fulfilling obligations as well as purpose from consuming. We are not just after personal achievement. Or if you read the social psychology literature, overwhelmingly, what people are about is actually meeting obligations. Can I finish with one little quick evidence from a new social psychology survey, which is great. You can do it yourselves tonight. It just asks people, what are the 3 things in your life that you most regret? And then the social psychologists just assemble all the answers to that. Right? The 3 things in your life you most regret. And if we were all economic man, Friedman-type economic man, it'd be quite clear what you'd most regret. Right? If only I'd bought that house, if only I hadn't messed up that job interview, if only I'd bought Apple shares, you know. And they don't feature at all. They're not there. All the 3 things that people most regret are, I let my mother down. I let my kids down. They're breaches of obligation. We are fundamentally social animals, moral animals, and we need a sense of purpose. And we need to get back to, as it were, narratives that rebuild these reciprocal sense of purpose and obligations. And so I'm not keen on equality in its, as the end objective. I think it's overemphasizes consumption. And nor am I keen on unions as oppositional identities. I agree with Cal about the importance of unions, but because they're part of, by equalizing power, you find it easier to actually make reciprocal commitments. There's a very useful theory in economics called the paradox of power, which says that by relinquishing some power, you can often be better able to achieve what you want, because it overcomes the time consistency problem. And that's what the powerful unions did. They enabled people to make reciprocal obligations.
So one brief reply, and then I would probably leave
Is equality a goal in itself? I would say no. But what is a goal in itself is to have common beliefs and common views on the world, because then you can solve things that are collective problems. For example, global warming. But if you have huge differences, then you don't live shared lives. You don't have common beliefs, and then there's no basis to solve life-threatening problems for the world. Are unions a goal in itself? No. But involvement from below is, and this has proven to be very good institutions for power below. They are in the decline, so we have to replace them by something else.
Okay. Before we leave it at that, just for people who want to find out more, there is the book, which obviously, Paul, you think everybody should buy, and probably buy a number of copies for
at least 3
for nephews who are earning £700
then
an
write
hour.
A review on Amazon.
On Amazon.
Someone has stolen my copy. I placed it on the table.
There's another one behind there, I think. Where else can people find out about some of the ideas, other ideas, and ideas that are adjacent to what's being argued here, in terms of learning online and that kind of thing? Where can people find out more?
Well, I've done an edX course. I did Oxford's first MOOC. MOOCs, mass open online courses, right? So it's Oxford's first. It's called From Poverty to Prosperity, and so far 68,000 people have followed the course, which is 3 times Oxford University's entire enrollment. So that's one start.
Okay, so they can watch that played back.
Yeah, edX.
edX. Okay.
Yeah.
Have you anything you want to tell people to follow you on?
I recommend the book highly, and also recommend another book that Paul has written, The Bottom Billion. Sorry.
Yeah, The Bottom Billion. It's in Norwegian. It's even in Norwegian.
It is really a good book. As I recommend both.
And so modest. Any of your own stuff you want to recommend?
Read, my own things. Write to me and I'll send you a long list.
Okay, all right, good. Alamona and Paul Collier, ladies and gentlemen. Give him a round of applause. Thank you.